Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joe Levine. I'm Executive Director for External Affairs at Teachers College. We have just concluded here at Teachers College the debate between the education advisors to the two presidential candidates. And we are going to follow that now with a special post-debate analysis with a distinguished panel that is being moderated by David Hoff, an associate editor at Education Week. And I will let David describe to you the members of the panel and how it's going to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone, for sticking around. As Joe said, we hope that this panel will be a responding panel, and to do so in a way that won't necessarily stake out political positions, but be more analytical, and then hopefully some forward-looking analysis that will give a sense as to how perhaps school policy would change over the next 4 years, whether or not there's a McCain administration or an Obama administration. So I'd like to introduce our panels before we get started. To my left here is Lucy Calkins, who is the Robinson Professor of Children's Literature here at Teachers College, as well as the director of the Reading and Writing Project at Teachers College. Off to the far left is Jeffrey Hinnig, a professor of political science and education and the program coordinator of that topic here at Teachers College. To my immediate right is Joseph Viteretti, who is the Blanche D. Blank Professor of Public Policy and the chair of the Department of Urban Affairs and Planning at Hunter College. And also of note, Joe in his past has worked in school districts in Boston, San Francisco, and here in New York, and yes, here in New York City. And finally, to the far right is Eugene Hickok, who is now with Ditko Worldwide, a public affairs firm. And in his past, he was Deputy Secretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education under George Bush for 4 years in the first term, and before that, Secretary of Education in Pennsylvania. So I think what would be a good way to start, we heard an hour and a half of substantive, detailed explanations from the advisors to the campaigns about education policies, but as we chatted afterwards, the five of us, we've noted that there were several things left unsaid. Lucy, would you like to start? Just lay out what you think was unsaid.
Well, one of the things that stood out to me was that I came expecting to hear a lot of talk about No Child Left Behind. And I think it's becoming more and more clear that No Child Left Behind hasn't done the job of making sure that no kids are left behind. That in fact, the scores on the NAEP are flatlined. And we're really not seeing that all the core reading programs that were mandated by the former administration have moved kids along. So I thought it was interesting that there was very little talk about trying to analyze what were the failures. There was little emphasis on that testing did not seem to really lead to standards in Leave No Child Behind. And so that would be one of the things that I think needs to be looked at again.
Jeff.
Well, let me say first of all that there was a lot that was discussed, and we'll talk about it. And for people who followed the campaign, they haven't had a lot of chance to hear the differences between the candidate, and some real differences did emerge in the debate we just heard. I was struck by the fact that we had a long discussion and no mention almost at all of states and local districts. These are the units of government that historically have been seen as the primary vehicles for addressing education needs. Historically, in a debate like this, it would often have been the case that the person representing the Republican candidate would have felt a strong need to mention a tradition of states' rights and states' control. There were some very subtle mentions of the need to allow states to continue to be the ones to set standards. There were no mentions at all of local districts. which ultimately are the units that are still at the ground level responsible for carrying out a lot of the things that were discussed today.
Joe.
I think that both Lisa and Linda did a fine job representing their candidates in the midst of a campaign that has paid very little attention to education. But I agree with Lucy. I mean, the one issue that has really been underserved in this campaign has been No Child Left Behind. And that's important for two reasons. It's the one thing that the next president will definitely have to respond to. The legislation was up a year ago, and something has to be done. And it's also a law that, in addition to trying to help the country fare better on a world scene, it brings us back to a question that began with the original ESEA legislation, and that is this gap in learning that exists in this country that's defined largely by race and is more pronounced in American cities where a disproportionate number of the students are either African American or Latino. I don't think it's an accident that it's being avoided either, because there's a lot of ambivalence in the country about No Child Left Behind. People seem to like standards, but they're not crazy about testing, and it's hard to separate them. There's also an ambivalence in the two parties that will have to come to terms with this in a legislative sense. I think there are particular questions that I think have to be confronted, and I'll just mention them as questions at this point, and then maybe we can take them further. No Child Left Behind requires the states to come up with both standards and tests with the expectation that the federal government will come in as an enforcement arm when school districts are seen as not meeting the standards that they set. The state standards are very uneven in this country. I think Lisa did mention that. And it raises a question that was asked as a question here, but has not been dealt with in the campaign very much. Should we have national tests and standards? And perhaps reverse the order and have the federal government set standards and have a national test, and have the states move to enforcement of these standards. There are a number of other issues I could mention, but rather than monopolize this, let me.
We're going to turn to No Child Left Behind later and invite you to bring those up there. Gene.
I guess I kind of agree and disagree. First of all, I thought it was a good, robust discussion. It was not particularly a new discussion. The issues have been out there for quite a while. There's some variations on the approaches, but I think all the typical kinds of issues were tossed about, and I think the two sides were pretty well understood going in. On No Child Left Behind, I think the issue would be that they talked a lot of it, but not about it. They talked about teacher quality, that's No Child Left Behind. They talked about assessments and standards and accountability and AYP and choice. They did not mention supplemental educational services, which is an important part of the law, at least initially as understood. So I think you're right, they talked of the issues embraced in No Child Left Behind, not No Child Left Behind itself. And politically, that makes sense for both of them, because as you pointed out, Joe, politically, it's a tough issue. It was a bipartisan consensus, perhaps the only bipartisan thing to happen during the last 8 years. You had strong Democratic ownership of it and strong Republican ownership of it, and both parties are running away from it a bit too. So politically, I can understand why neither candidate's spokesperson this evening had a full throttle endorsement of NCLB, but certainly I think they talked about the issues embraced in it.
We'll come back to No Child Left Behind in more specifics later, but I would like to hear from the panel now. I mean, what were some of the key differences that you saw that emerged tonight, either philosophically or tied to a very specific issue that was raised tonight? Lucy?
Well, I'm reminded of a story that's been around a while of two guys standing beside the edge of a river, and they look out and see a drowning person floating by, drowning kid. And one of the guys jumps in saves the kid, and lo and behold, looks around, there's 5 more drowning kids coming by, and he jumps back in and tries to save another one. And then there's 13 kids, drowning kids floating by, and he's, oh my God, and heads back in. And meanwhile, his friend hightails it off into the woods, and he calls off to his friend, so where are you going? And the friend says, I'm going upstream to see who's throwing them in. It seems to me that you can capture a fair number of the differences between the two, in that I think that McCain's platform is about trying to get instant lifelines thrown to this kid and that one and this one as best as they can, often through private sources or through immediate measures of one sort or another, various systems to get more people into teaching, or to have Sylvan learning centers, or whatever it might be, the virtual schools that technology is going to provide, and so forth. And that what Obama's trying to do is to head upstream and figure out how can we make a system that doesn't have drowning kids. And that his emphasis there is really on creating a profession of teaching, and making teaching into a place where good people want to come and to stay, and creating mentorships and collaborative planning for teachers, and a different way of assessing, and the conditions that will create a system that might not have so many drowning kids.
Jeff.
Well, so I was trying to keep score while the debate was going on, and I think there was, at least 6 areas of pretty clear difference, none of which are sharply surprising. You have McCain standardized testing versus Obama multiple assessment methods portfolios. You have McCain recruitment, emphasize teacher recruitment and pay for achievement, versus Obama mentoring and career ladders and building a professional career. You have Obama invest in various kinds of education, McCain an overall freeze and reduce barriers as a way to bring about change. You have Obama early childhood as a major emphasis, mentioned a lot of times, versus choice and vouchers, including a pretty specific assertion of the value of vouchers in DC, and a strong claim about what the research shows about vouchers. And you have Obama looking at structures and systems, and McCain looking at money getting directly to principals and students. One other difference, which was a little surprising, I don't think it's all that surprising from a standpoint of the politics of the election, but that is the representative of one of the candidates mentioned minorities and race independently, unprompted, 4 times, and that was Lisa Graham Keegan speaking for Senator McCain. I thought that was interesting.
Joe, differences?
I don't think there are major differences. I think one of the major differences I see is their attitude towards money. Linda kept mentioning invest. My question is invest from what, from where? Given the state of the economy, the growing deficit, and the fact that we're fighting 2 wars, I don't think there's going to be much money to invest in education. So I think to plan a program or an agenda around more money makes no sense. I mean, even with a significant investment of money in No Child Left Behind the last time out, the federal government is still pays about 9% of the bill in education. That's not going to grow at all, unless it may grow because there's going to be less investment at the state level and the local level also. The other thing is there's a slight difference on the issue of teachers and merit pay, and how that might be brought about, and whether it should be individualized or by the school. And I haven't heard anybody really come up with a plan that would tell us how to execute that. It's a good idea to say you want to pay teachers more money who do well, but we really haven't come up with a way to evaluate that very carefully.
Gene?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think the biggest difference, other than the sort of the policy debate within certain parameters, really the biggest difference is a philosophical one. And I think you got to it, Lucy. I think if you look at most of the proposals by the Obama team, it is basically how do we change, improve, reform, move this system forward. And it really is a system focus. Whereas I think with McCain, it's more of how do we more directly affect the lives of families and kids. And then we can debate whether it should be choices or charters or highly qualified teachers, but I think it's a philosophically very different approach, which I think it was explicit early on, at least in both camps, because I think when Obama started talking during the campaign and in this debate about the importance of investing in the system properly and getting results, McCain was saying we need to spend money directly on where the system is failing us with the kids. Two things I thought were missing in the discussion, which I thought could have been very, very helpful. One is no discussion on one of the fundamental challenges of the system, and that's the governance of it, how it's organized to provide education. I don't mean the government like federal, state, and local. I mean the governance of public education and how it has systemic problems, and they're very difficult to address, and perhaps a good reason why both candidates have not done that. But that to me is a very big one. And secondly, and maybe this will grow out of the discussion with McCain down the road, if indeed there is a down the road, and that is there any way to rethink how we deliver education? We tend to confuse schooling and education in this country. We had this great debate tonight about preschool, but it still was in the context of schooling. And it seems to me that we're cutting ourselves short, that maybe what we ought to do is stop having so many policy discussions that lead to more regulations and more of this sort of compliance mentality, which sort of governs American education. And maybe have more of an innovation and creativity strategy that really gets away from what we've been doing and thinks about the possibilities. Now, maybe that's just theoretical, but until we have more discussions like that, the debate we had tonight will be the debate we have 4 years from now.
Lucy, you want to add something?
Can I talk back to that?
Sure.
I just, I think it's interesting to understand, tonight I was surprised by the extent to which helping kids for McCain had to do with improving scores. Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, we literally heard Lisa say it all comes down to the scores. It seemed as if she was saying, you know, take down the barriers to bring anyone in to teaching, you know, bring anyone in with whatever background as long as we get the scores. And I think that there's a number of problems with that, but one problem is that the assumption that these scores that we're getting are valid, that they have reliability, that they are really assessing. I mean, the standards say we want kids, and Diane Ravitch has written about this, we want kids to be able to analyze and to synthesize and to discuss and to think critically. And do these scores really show that? And then when we look at Mississippi, where all the kids are doing beautifully on their state tests, and really realize that the scores have become something of a fallacy because of the No Child Left Behind pressure to, you know, alter our state tests so that everybody is succeeding. I think that's a real problem that has to be addressed with the notion that as long as that McCain wants to rescue all of these kids, as defined by getting better scores.
Well, let's turn then to No Child Left Behind and really focus in on that. One of the differences we heard tonight in talking about testing was that Senator Obama believes that there are better tests that are possible and presumably affordable. From Lisa Graham Keegan, we heard that, you know, that it's important to have test results that are standardized across the state. I mean, that obviously is a significant difference. When thinking about testing, how feasible is it to keep No Child Left Behind's focused on a standardized test result by doing a different type of testing?
I think tests are here to stay. I think there are particular questions about testing, though, that we need to deal with. One of the questions about testing, I think, is people are frustrated because they believe we're teaching to the test, and they also believe, parents and teachers, that if you don't test it, you don't teach it. And that's a legitimate concern. We need to confront the question of whether we need to test in reading and math every year on a standardized way. And we also have to ask the question, should we be testing in other areas? You've got to look at the mix of the tests. I think Lisa is right, and I think it was interesting that she made a connection that you need to document failure. You can't ignore it. And it's the reason why the civil rights community is very concerned that much of this will be lost. And I would just point to an editorial that was in the New York Times, of all places, last August that talked about renewing No Child Left Behind, and the title of the editorial was A Civil Rights Issue. So I think testing is here to stay. I think what we have to do is rethink it a bit and look at the mix of the tests and the frequency of the tests.
Gene, do you have something?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a false dichotomy or a false choice between standardized testing, when the goal really is not just standardized testing, but sort of being able to compare among states, among schools, among kids, and transparency. So you have information that people can understand about where their kids are. That's one argument. That doesn't necessarily have to be, quote, fill in the bubble test. That might be where we are right now, but we could be doing much better. The other side says we need a more fulsome approach to accountability that looks at the total needs and the total character of the education the child's receiving. I think you can do both. I think testing down the road will be the issue under No Child Left Behind in terms of the hot button issue. People are tired of tests, but they do want accountability. I think the movement has to be toward bringing this fulsome approach in line with the need for both transparency and comparability.
Well, one issue, as Joe raised, is that we have uneven standards. I mean, and are we going to need to move to, or is there going to be some organic movement, as Lisa Graham-Keegan was suggesting, towards a set of common standards and tests that get adopted by states?
I think there is an organic movement in place already. And I think there's a misunderstanding about how No Child Left Behind happens. We have led ourselves to believe that it came out of Washington. It really came out of the states to begin with. Most states had standards and testing before No Child Left Behind passed, or it would have never passed. It's the same thing we did with special education. 44 states had special education laws before we passed a federal law. Things don't always start in Washington. They very rarely start in Washington. They start in the states, and then the Congress approves it because that's where the constituency wants.
If I could just add to that, I do think there's a difference between national standards and national testing and nationalization of standards. And that's what's taking place. You have the ability now to go on the web and compare state standards, compare state scores, and that will gradually lead to more of a national consensus of where we need to be without standards coming on down from on high from Washington, which I think politically is very difficult to see.
Lucy, you brought up about how you're worried about the emphasis on testing, and that No Child Left Behind has brought that out, but yet there's been uneven standards. Would you see a nationalization or national tests as a positive step forward, or would you like to see a step back from testing?
Well, I think testing, anybody who's in classrooms knows that the tests have really taken over schools. I was calculating that the 4th and 5th graders in New York City, I think, spend 10% of the days during their school year, they're taking a standardized test. They're taking a standardized test on at least 18 of the days. And if you just think that for each of those days, they'll spend a couple days doing some test prep, pretty soon we really, so when Lisa said, oh, people who spend time bubbling in, I mean, that's nonsense. I think that the fact of the matter is, if you've got a standardized test on 10% of the days, that it's going to be that you have something like 50% of the school year An awful lot of teachers are going to be thinking about standardized tests, especially in situations like we have in New York City, where 85% of a school's quality review, some people come to visit the school and to give it a quality review, and 85% of the score is based solely on the results of really just a very, very limited number of those standardized tests. Do I think that testing's the issue that has to be tackled? Absolutely. Do I think it's going to go away? No. I do think it's the tail that wags the dog, and that we really need to make sure that we're assessing things that we care very much about, because what we assess is going to be what we teach. So I think we should be looking again at the assessments, and that we should be thinking really carefully about how do we do more performance assessments and more formative assessments, alternate years for testing, or every third year for standardized tests. Yes, absolutely.
Jeff, you're a political scientist. What role do you see for the next president in this whole debate over, nationalization versus national tests and standards?
Well, I think the next president is going to be, boxed into some corners by the politics of it and what's led into this. And ultimately, let's be clear: if it's a McCain presidency and a Democratic Congress, that's going to be a different outcome than if it's, a McCain presidency and a Republican Congress. So you have to take the whole political structure into account. I want to say that I do want to come back to, just if you'll let me for a minute, to this issue of the testing, because that's where there's a real disconnect between some of the discussion and what people who are in the education field talk about, which is that the testing phenomenon has radically changed what life is like in the school level. And yet, if I heard Lisa Graham-Keegan correctly, her stance was, well, actually, if you get good teachers and they do the things that we want them to do, arts and civics and things like that, then the tests will take care of themselves. And that would be, and if that's true, that's nice. But I think that's a real empirical question as to whether there's been an experience of tension at the grassroots level. I think that her position makes sense if the testing is meant, as Joe suggested, to just identify the failures, see where the problems are. But right now we have a testing system tied ultimately to a notion of 100% proficiency, and that wasn't discussed much. It was kind of ducked. I take by inference that both candidates are going to reconsider that notion of proficiency as the anchor point for testing. I could be wrong. One other thing that I do want to make sure we say, which is because, as Joe said, and I think we all would agree, that the financial situation, fiscal situation, national level, state and local level is going to be dire in the near term. There are some things in education policy, like there are in regular policy, that aren't directly cost things. Another issue that was not discussed at all today is the Supreme Court. It's an issue that's not in general being mentioned, but the Supreme Court historically has been important in terms of a range of issues that affect school districts. There will be a difference in the Supreme Court depending on which candidate is sitting in the White House.
Let's move on to teacher quality. That obviously falls down from No Child Left Behind. It is a part of the law. I thought one of the, sharpest exchanges was regarding Teach for America and the approach towards getting new teachers between the two. On the Obama side, there was, Linda was talking about building a system, and from the McCain side, Lisa was talking about perhaps, getting new people into the system and letting them change the system from within, the school systems from within. Obviously, the teacher pay issue is a big one, and when we think about teacher quality, the biggest difference between these two perhaps is the teacher pay, and that came up tonight. Could that distract us from the broader debate over how to get highly qualified teachers into the classroom as part of a No Child Left Behind?
I keep looking at the teacher issue, and I hear both candidates seem to be talking about it a lot. And I hate to say it strikes me as one of the issues that the federal government will be least able to do anything about. Teachers are certified and licensed by states. Teacher contracts are written in school districts. They talk about incentivizing. Incentivizing means putting a little money into something so that states pick up on it. I don't think there's going to be that much money available for that kind of stuff, especially when there are other things in education we have to do. So I guess I have to say there's a lot of talk about it, and if there's one thing they're both talking about a lot, it's teachers. And it's an important issue. I'm not saying it's not an important issue. But they're not running the state education department. They're going to the White House. And I haven't seen, to me, one of the great failures of No Child Left Behind, which was probably the most aggressive federal effort we've seen in American history, is it hasn't done much about the teaching profession.
Well, I think it's, there's few things that could be more important than improving the quality of teaching. I think No Child Left Behind even included in it that the only opportunity to learn that was so critical that it was guaranteed in No Child Left Behind was the opportunity for all children to have qualified teachers. And of course, if we really think about the real inequities, it's that the kids who need the best qualified teachers are right now very often they're getting novice teachers, and they're getting teachers who are the products of fast-track certification programs and waivers, sort of duck under the gate and here you go teach. I definitely, of course, there's a tremendous difference between the two. I thought it was captured, especially not tonight, but in the debates when McCain said, I really believe in that troops to the classroom. We've got to bring our troops home, and I mean, they shouldn't have to bother with the little tests or certification that some states are thinkers, are talking about, or something like that. I think that that having a president who values professional study and the profession of teaching and sees teaching as something challenging and difficult that people study, and that we need to really listen to the voices of teachers and learn the craft of teaching, the skill of teaching. To me, that's very important. And I worry if we have a federal government that is trying to bring down all the boundaries to let anybody into teaching. I worry that it's going to be less and less well-qualified teachers teaching the kids who have the most needs.
Jean, you've held positions in the U.S. Capitol and the capital of Pennsylvania. I mean, what's your perspective? Can the federal government be instrumental in changing the quality of teachers throughout the country?
One thing that goes in the back of my mind as I listen to the conversation tonight, right now, and also the earlier one, is in reality, even though we had No Child Left Behind, which is a pretty important piece of federal education legislation, in reality, there's relatively little that a president can do to change American education. But one thing a president can do is change the way America talks about education and begins to think about education. When I was in Harrisburg in the state capitol, I think my administration and my governor's administration would have benefited tremendously from a Washington administration that was talking about the things we were doing at that time. It would have made it easier to put our policies in context with the state legislature, with the State Board of Education, with local school boards. So whether it's teacher quality or funding or all these issues, the biggest thing we can hope for from either of these candidates is bring to the table that kind of rich discussion, because in the end, it really is a state and local issue. And it ain't going to change anytime soon.
Jeff.
I want to say, and I think I can say it in a way that builds on Jean's last point. I think, if you had asked me 5-10 years ago whether recruitment was a major issue in education, I would have said yes. I think that what we've learned from Teach for America and some of the alternative routes in is you can change, that the image of teaching has been changed. I mean, I think it really has been changed in the broad social conception by the influx of young, smart, enthusiastic, energetic people, which is not to say that teachers in the existing systems weren't that, but I think the image has changed and you can get good young people into schools. Retention is a critical problem, and the issue of how do you weed out the non-performers, whether you can rely on a system where parents have the option, parents and principals, that's going to take care of the problem without a system of oversight, regulation, and enforcement. Those are real philosophical differences. But I do think changing the conception of teaching, raising the public understanding of the value and importance of education are things that President with the bully pulpit can do, and is something they'll have to do since they won't have a lot of money to throw around.
If I'm going to move towards choice now, and Jeff, you've written extensively on the charter movement and other forms of choice. Do you sense that the debate over those issues are beginning to change in this presidential election?
Yeah, I do. It's begun to change. I mean, it began to change before this. You know, back 5-10 years ago, the battle lines were fought over the word choice, and you were either pro-choice or anti-choice. Almost no one now takes an anti-choice stance in terms of education. Some will say, well, I'm for public school choice, but most, you know, and some will say that, and the most conservative position now is I'm for public school choice within districts. But charter schools have been broadly accepted now, even in the teacher community. Survey shows teachers are pretty similar to the broad public in terms of their support for the notion of charters, at least good charters. There's still debate over market-oriented choice versus choice in a structured, regulated system, but the debate has shifted all the way back down to, you know, voucher versus non-voucher, and that came up today, and it would be, you know, tempting to make a big deal of it, but I think that's not where the real story is. The real story is that the rest of the debate, charter school, public school choice, and things, has been joined by both sides, and there's differences in nuance and important differences in nuance, but that's not the old battle line.
Well, if I could ask a follow-up, and anyone can take this on, do we then expect that in this next administration, regardless of who is president, we're going to see an federal expansion in charter schools, and therefore the growth of charter schools throughout the country, whether it's through the bully pulpit, you know, money, something? Joe?
It strikes me how little choice is an issue in this campaign compared to the last one. When I wrote Choosing Equality 10 years ago, Lisa Graham Keegan was, pardon the expression, a maverick in Arizona because she had the audacity as a state education executive to support charter schools. Well, she's won that battle, so now everybody's for charter schools. And vouchers is kind of a marginal issue now, except for Washington, D.C. And I don't know if we'll have a serious discussion about that. And I don't think it will until we get past the rhetoric, frankly, of Milton Friedman and the market and competition, which kind of put it as it put choice, an issue that started with people like Jack Koons as an equity and opportunity issue, and it made it a competitive issue that what choice was going to do was close down public schools. Which is, that's not what choice really can do, whether you look at it from public's perspective or private's perspective. If you go and talk to teachers in private schools or public schools, the one thing they have in common is they're there to work with kids. They don't see it as a competition. It's the rhetoric of people like us, I guess, or people who do what we do for a living, that kind of drew that discussion drew it out in a very combative way that never led to a productive dialogue. And both sides liked it that way because people on the left or the Democrats realized that the markets were a dead issue, and people on the right didn't figure that out. And they're still talking about markets when anybody who's lived through the last month and has faith in markets has had their head in the ground. But they're still talking about it, some of them. So, I mean, it really comes down to how, if we're going to have that discussion in the future, how we construct it.
Gene.
I do think there's been somewhat of a culture shift in American education on the issue of choice. And I would argue two things looking forward will sort of drive that conversation. One is the economy. Someone far wiser than I said a long time ago, nothing stimulates the imagination like a budget cut. Well, as states and locals undergo tremendous financial problems, there's going to be all kinds of creativity out there, driven by necessity. And the second one's going to be the fact that I think one reason choice is more accepted in its broadest sense is the relative frustration of lots of people with the quality of education their schools get. It wasn't a pro-market embrace or a philosophical embrace. It really was, I got to do something for my kids. And as long as that sentiment continues, I think choice in its broadest sense will begin to continue to be a fundamental part of our fabric. That includes choice in teaching, choice in schools, and everything else.
We're getting close to the end of our time. We have about 5 minutes left. So I'd just like to ask this concluding question, if each of you can address it. And briefly, in about a minute or so. We hear from Linda Darling from the Obama campaign that a presidency under Senator Obama would invest $10 billion a year in early childhood education. I mean, I think that's, judging from what you've all said, there's some questions as to whether that type of money is going to be available. But the question is $10 billion, is early childhood education the best place to put $10 billion of new federal money? Lucy.
I can't really imagine a better place. I think that the evidence is really clear that every dollar that you put into early childhood education makes kids more able to succeed. And the best way for kids to do well in school and in life is for them to be successful from the start, and for us not to be forever trying to somehow make it up to them. So I think it's a very wise decision.
Jeff.
Well, I'd like to expand it in one sense and say that thinking about things outside traditional K-12 education that can help the performance of K-12 education is worthwhile. And that includes early childhood education. That's out there now, but there's a whole range of issues, public health issues, issues related to inequality, concentrated poverty, and the like, where there's arguably a chance that attending to those is going to have a bigger impact on some of the things that show up in test scores than programs specifically funneled into the educational institution.
Joe?
I don't think it's a bad place to invest the money. I don't think the money will be there anyway, but it's not a bad place if the money's used well, and that's always the question in education. It's not how much you spend always, it's how you use it.
Gene.
Yeah, that'd be my response as well. I mean, obviously, it's what you do with the money, not where you spend it, but how you spend it, and how you measure the impact of a dollar invested on changing a child's life. And so to say early childhood money doesn't say much to me. It depends on exactly what you're going to do and the results you're going to get from it.
Thank you very much. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say thank you to each of the panelists. It was really, I think, substantive and in-depth conversation about this campaign and the possible future for the federal role in education. And in closing, I'd like to thank Teachers College for sponsoring this event and say good night.